Welcome to Top Talk, where we take important conversations to the cross of Christ. I'm your host and contributor, Trekeelia Simon. As we continue to deal with the impact of what's taking place in our society in regards to race relations and even COVID-19, the pandemic, we want to take some time to talk about something that all of us have probably experienced both directly and vicariously at some point in our lives, and that's trauma. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to unpack historical and intergenerational trauma and talk about its impact. We're also going to discuss what trauma looks like in children and adults. And finally, we'll talk about how we can build emotional strength and resilience in our families. I am here today with two brilliant social workers in our community, Jessica Grant, who is a licensed master social worker, and Narkeya Byrd, who is a licensed behavioral therapist. Hello, ladies.
Hello. Glad to be here and joining you in this discussion.
It is great to have you both. We're going to go ahead and jump in and just get started with this. Let's talk about historical and intergenerational trauma. What is it? And then what's the impact look like today?
As we talk about historical and intergenerational trauma, it's important that, people understand exactly what trauma is by itself. And so, I always like to have, Webster's definition of, any word so that I can know the true meaning behind it. So trauma is defined as an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by individuals. And it is harmful to them and it's threatening to them, and it affects that person's well-being. So when we talk about historical or intergenerational trauma, to me, we're talking about, what has happened to really minorities as a whole historically. So a lot of times I like to give examples for people to understand what we're talking about. And that's like, the enslavement of people of African descent, like the Holocaust and Trail of Tears for those that are Native American. So those are harmful, emotional, harming to people and individuals and their generations after that. So that's like that historical trauma that has happened, but also with intergenerational. Like if that happened to your grandparent or your parent or your great-grandparent, then you feel that trauma as well through stories and things like that. So it's really, historical trauma is that the symptom of that is the intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Jessica, for giving that background, because that is a really important point, that we do need to know what trauma is. And once we know that, then we can sort of understand some of those other things that you talked about with intergenerational trauma. It's sometimes called generational trauma or multi-generational trauma. But yes, it can be taught, and also just the behaviors. So a lot of times, even if, things aren't necessarily spoken and that's passed down from generation to generation through teaching, some of the behaviors that come as a result of that traumatic experience are passed down. And so people think and people respond the same way as previously because they have seen that and they've modeled that. And we see that a lot in our society today. Just the hurt and the pain that people have experienced from seeing mistreatment and injustice, and all of these difficulties that we're experiencing. And it takes you back to what your parents experienced or your grandparents, even if you weren't there. You can feel that and you can grasp that because it's a part of your family line. It does become personal to you, and you start experiencing the same effects that trauma has, regardless of whether you yourself have been personally impacted.
Mm-hmm. When we were talking about, some questions and some things we wanted to talk about that would be really pertinent to this discussion, Jessica, you mentioned something. You talked about racism and inequality as a sickness. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Right. So when you learn about historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, like there's things that manifest from that trauma, and a lot of things that if you're looking at the African American race, or and we're thinking about what kind of effects has that trauma had on us, a lot of those are things that we can relate to today, like mental health diagnosis, with anxiety and depression, and especially anxiety, like around what's going on, feeling that overwhelming feeling, depression, the sadness that comes from seeing things like this in the news that are affecting us personally, can be manifested in us, and we're not sure, how we navigate those feelings. And then also just from the oppression and the racism that has our socioeconomic status, affects that socioeconomic status, where, a lot of people are in poverty, or, they have that mentality where, it's pressed on you, you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But, that's not always the case. You have to, there's so many different ways that, your life and your environment and your family structure can prevent that from, being something that you can, rely on. You have to, there's a lot more that goes into that, in your whole family structure. And then even, with rioting and looting and stuff like that, some people may not be part of, the actual movement of making things better, but a lot of people have that mentality where, there's no trust of authority. So, there's like, even if this change or that change, if somebody is, held accountable for their actions, they feel like it's not enough. It's not going to stick, or it's not going to be permanent or make an effect on them or their children. So therefore, that it still goes on. It's still an underlying issue.
And I think when you were talking about the, sickness, I think I also thought about just stress and the impact of stress and how that physiologically impacts our body. There's a correlation between mental health issues or emotional issues and high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, things of that nature. So your body physically starts to change as a result of trauma and stress. And that's the case in both children and adults over time, in children who experience traumatic events. We call those adverse childhood experiences. And, the fortunate thing is, some of those things can be mitigated when you have more resiliency factors in your life. When you have a good support system, when you have, maybe you received therapy and you got some of those things, but in situations where you don't, you sometimes are more prone to a lot of health issues as you get older, especially when you don't have good coping skills. And so you could physically see changes in your body in regards to stress and trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are studies out there that have been done, research studies that have been completed that show that how much it negatively impacts your health to be a minority. All of the things that come with that status of being a minority, and all of the results of that, and the symptoms of what the experience has been, is unhealthy physically. And they talk about the disparities in healthcare and the cost to healthcare, and how our bodies are impacted, because yes, like you said, there are all of those things. There's stress, there's exhaustion, there's fatigue. Jessica talked about the fear, the anxiety, and even as we talked about generational trauma, I don't know if you guys have seen it yet, but I saw this video on social media where this kid looks like no more than 10 years old or so is playing basketball just in front of his own house, and he hides when he sees a police car coming by. So I'm pretty sure that he's probably never had an actual experience with a police officer, but he has a response of fear and anxiety when he sees that car drive by, So he hides and he's not even doing anything wrong, you know? And so that's the impact of that generational trauma, because I have seen what has happened to this person and that person. I've heard tale of what's happened to my family member and my, you know, my uncle and my grandfather. And I don't want it to happen to me. So
Right.
I'm just gonna, you know, I'm a hide,
Right.
you know, and that's exhausting.
Yeah, it is very exhausting. I agree with you. We've covered this a little bit, but what does trauma look like? What does that look like in a person? Let's talk about what that looks like in adults.
Yeah, it looks like some of the symptoms that we can see with trauma. Jessica mentioned a lot of them: depression, you know, fear, anxiety, exhaustion, stress, physical issues. You talked about that as well. The physical issues and physical health issues that are related to being stressed and anxious.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like social anxiety. It looks like isolation sometimes. You know, let me just keep to myself. It's safer that way. You know, so there are so many ways that this can produce responses,
Mm-hmm.
A trauma response. And for some people, it looks like anger. For some people, it looks like drug addiction and alcohol addiction.
Right.
I mean, we see this broad range of symptoms that come from traumatic experiences. And a lot of people sometimes don't know even what that is. They didn't even know they were a victim of any type of trauma, because they might say it didn't happen to you or to me, but we've witnessed things that are traumatic, you know, and it's hard on our psyche to really process that and figure out, okay, what do I do with this information and how do I stay safe? How do I stay clear of it? You know, how do I rest? How do I, you know, think past it and process through it? How do I keep living knowing this information that I know, or having this information that I have?
Right. And just thinking about what you were saying is that a lot of, there has been a lot of studies and people that, you know, different countries that incorporated mental health professionals and social workers and people like that into their for specifically for children, like pediatric care,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because, you know, a child may go to the, you know, doctor numerous times, like they're always getting stomach aches, or, you know, they always have some type of issue and the parent cannot pinpoint what that is, you know, and a lot of times it can be something stemming from some type of trauma, and that they are feeling these actual physical issues from that. And that needs to be something that, you know, we look for as a parent as well, you know, when our kids have constant things going on with them, and there's not like something that you can physically, you know, you can look at and say, yes, this is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so we have to bring that into context when we're thinking about, you know, how you know, different adults and children can react to something like trauma. And like we were talking about with the physical parts of it, it's easier for people to understand when they have when they can figure out how it connects, and they can feel it or see it or diagnose it, something like that. And so, you know, we previously talked about racism and inequality as a sickness. And so we have to treat it as a sickness, like we do with, you know, with cancer or with a virus or all this kind of stuff. We have to combat it. And one of the things I saw on a lot on Facebook and things like that, you know, one of the things that is combating this sickness is anti-racism, not just, you know, saying that, you know, we care about this, you know, we're with you on this, we're all together, but actually, you know, putting forth the effort to combat and be anti, you know, about the whole situation. And, you know, that comes along with a lot of different things that you can do to be able to do that.
When you were talking about children, I thought just about my own child this morning, and wasn't necessarily a traumatic issue, but I heard him say, well, Mommy, I don't have a stomach ache anymore. When I play that game, I would get stomach aches. And I said, what do you mean? He was like, well, I didn't win. And so, you know, for him, he wants something to be perfect. He wants it to be a certain way. And what was happening was he was developing anxiety around not winning and not having the outcome that he wanted. And so I had to be really intentional about just having that conversation about a growth mindset. So whenever you make a mistake or you don't win, what does that say about you? And who you are? You're still awesome. You're still great. You just haven't gotten as good at it as you want to, and we keep trying. And so just having him connect thoughts to our feelings, and how sometimes the way we think about a thing can control the way we feel, and then how we act in turn. And so it's like you said, it's so important to pay attention to those symptoms and those signs in our kids, and even adults. Even sometimes adults have become so good at, hiding things, but then other symptoms pop up, and you all being mental health professionals, I'm sure you spot them a lot easier when people are having those, somatic issues that really speak to trauma or emotional issues that are going on. And I know in children, one of the things that I say often is that children are not little adults. They're not. Their brains are not fully developed. Their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And so, one of the biggest hurdles I think with trauma is that it really can alter the way a child sees themselves. When you're young and you're little, you get your cues from the grownups. Before you were able to talk, when you touch something you weren't supposed to, your parents would shake their finger at you until that let you know, okay, I'm getting feedback that that's something that I should not do. And so in situations where there might be even secondary trauma, or where your parents, maybe one of them was abused as a child, and so what they got all the time was yelling and screaming, and that was what was communicated to them. And so as they parent, those things come out in their parenting. And so, yelling, screaming, other things that are happening, it sends messages to kids. And sometimes those messages turn into negative thought patterns. Okay. Mm-hmm. It starts to affect their cognition. And so they associate that negative thought pattern with who they are as a person. And so it gives them a message: I'm bad, or I'm not good enough. And so that becomes like a permanent. I was reading an article that talked about it almost being like a permanent sensory memory for a kid that you can't undo. It's as hard to undo as it is. It's hard to unlearn how to ride a bike. And I was like, wow, that's really powerful. And so as that becomes a part of who you are and your psyche and your cognition, you associate those negative thoughts with who you are. And so you want to kind of hide those feelings, and you don't want to feel what that feels like. And so that's when you start to see the manifestation of behavior issues and things like that. Those are the things that we see in school. When I have kids who've dealt with trauma, you see misbehavior, but that misbehavior is the top of the iceberg. It's the tip. All that stuff that's going on underneath the water that you can't see the surface is a result of this negative thinking that they've developed around things that have happened to them. And they don't know what to do with that. So you see anxiety, you even see signs of depression in kids, the misbehavior, the acting out. We've probably heard tons of statistics about the rate at which our young Black boys specifically get suspended from school at a higher rate than other kids. And a lot of times, some of that underlying issue is trauma that they've dealt with in the home. And so it has a major impact across the age span. Mm-hmm. So let's move on a little bit and talk about what does secondary and vicarious trauma look like for people? I know even in education, when you're dealing with a student in your classroom who may have major behavior issues, and you have just gotten to the point where you are fatigued and exhausted, there are times where, you deal with that vicarious trauma. So what does vicarious trauma, secondary trauma look like for people?
So I'll start off just talking about vicarious trauma, because it's not really a word that a lot of people hear about and connect with. And I think it's important to understand because it's for those of us that are helping. So this is speaking to professionals or not, but that are in a position of a help role for people. And we start to feel the impacts and the fatigue associated with working with people that have been exposed to trauma. And so, like you mentioned, a good example with working with kids that may have some behavioral issues because they're dealing with trauma. And then we, at the end of the day, we take it with us. We're exhausted. We're trying to find strategies. We're thinking about it a lot. And we don't really take the time back to think about, okay, what are our needs at that time? Because it's a lot. It's a lot. And you want to help and you want to impact those around you. But at the same time, it's really important to take a look back and see how it's affecting you. And a lot of times, if you don't know that that component is there, you won't really pay attention to it, or you won't look for it and understand, okay, maybe I need to step back from this. Maybe I need to signal for somebody else to help me. Maybe I need to look at some other strategies or think of some other suggestions. Am I overextending in this area? Should I pull back? So those are really questions to ask, because it can affect your own personal life and your own personal family. So am I taking anger and stress, not really stress, out on, or exhaustion out on my own children, or my own family, because I am feeling exhausted from this situation. And so even when, it's really important to know that even when something may not have directly impacted us, if we're in a role that we are hearing people speaking constantly to us about those things and how they're struggling with those things, and we want to help, and then there might be another person, they're constantly feeding that information, it's hard to disconnect from that. So that's what that vicarious trauma is. And we start to experience a lot of what that other person is experiencing, even in a helping role.
Right. And while you were talking, I just always think about, for myself and for like clients that I have, like, is this affecting your, like what you were saying, activities of daily living? There's like a whole checklist for that you can kind of go down. But, if your sleep is being affected, if your work is being affected, and your parenting, things like that are being affected, then you have to really, be mindful of what's going on with yourself, in order to not continue to kind of spiral down with that, with the effects of that trauma. So that's important for adults, because as we navigate each day, we can take time to really evaluate what's going on. So if I'm go for a week and not sleeping good, what's going on with that? We have to continue kind of evaluating ourselves on, how that trauma is really affecting us. And then also, when you're engaging, like with our profession, with other people that also are experiencing trauma, we have to, not, put our feelings on to them. We have to be impartial when we're talking, and, just be mindful of what's going on in our personal lives that could come out when we're speaking, and be mindful of your words and actions, and, even facial expressions, because with all this has been going on, I've noticed, like, if somebody want to talk to me about what's going on and I don't feel like, like I done had enough for the day or something like that, I've been on social media too much, or, I read the comments, those types of things that didn't agree with me. And so I'm already kind of over it. And then someone asked me about it. Like, I know that my facial expressions will probably give me away real quick. So, I have to be very mindful of that. And I think that's important for everybody, just to kind of, I like to journal. So that's one of the things that helps me figure out, is something going on that, that I need to address. Because if I'm not feeling it, then there's probably something going on. Or if I am, what is the theme going on here? And so that kind of can, help you as an adult. With children, I really think it's important for parents, of course, to pay attention to what's going on. But children to know that, they can have trauma. A lot of times, adults and, people who are older, they're like, oh, they're resilient, they can bounce back from this. I've heard that, and that's not always the case. Everybody's different. It's something that's case by case basis. You have to, take that person, that child as they are, and really understand, how it may affect them differently than your other children. Because if you have more than one, you know that they all are not the same. You know, they all have different personalities. They respond differently. You know, you have one that always cries and one that, you know, doesn't care what happens, that they're just going to be standing firm and hard-headed, you know, things like that. And so you have to really take that into account when things are going on, that they might not necessarily say something, but there could be those feelings behind, that sternness if they have it. That's not always apparent.
Thank you guys for sharing that. I think when you were talking about, you started talking, and I think you guys have covered it as you talked about what it is that, helping professionals need to do when they are noticing that they're dealing with that trauma. And I heard you mention journaling and things like that. Self-care is so important when you are a helping professional, taking that time to do things that are meaningful to you and that are helpful to you in terms of coping, journaling, exercising. And we'll talk about some more of that later when we just talk about, strength building and resiliency and coping later. But I think it's, just want to mention here that for all helping professionals, like, it's really important, self-care. I know during the time where school was still in session and we had to go into quarantine, and so schools and things like that were closed, and everyone was having to shuffle and switch gears, and in the midst of still themselves being impacted by COVID-19, having to figure out how we're going to meet the needs of students at home, distance learning, and all of that good stuff. I participated in a couple of Zoom sessions with some other school counselors across the state. And so, some of them were just talking about how they were facilitating self-care sessions for teachers because, on top of, like I said, the way that stress and the impact of COVID was for them, they also had the added pressure and the added stress of teaching in a way they never had before. And even self-care for, other people, other mental health professionals who were working with people doing, distance or telecommunication in terms of counseling and therapy and things like that. Everything was just very different. And so that was something that was also a focus during that time. Mm-hmm. So we want to switch gears a little bit, and we want to talk about our kids because, we live in a time where there's a lot going on in our climate in regards to race relations and lots of things that have happened that have been very tragic. And so sometimes some of our kids are well aware of what's going on. And so, what would be some age appropriate conversations? What is an age appropriate way to talk to your children about race relations and what's going on in our society? And the first thing I would say is, one, know your child. My son in particular is super sensitive. And so at his age, he's only 6. And so there are a lot of things that I wouldn't discuss with him at this point. And some kids who might be older might also be sensitive and might not be able to handle certain things. So that's one thing to consider, is to know your child. And another thing is that our older kids, some of them are on social media. Some of them see things and may come to us with things and with questions. And so we have to prepare ourselves to answer questions and deal with reactions and walk them through things. One of the things that I read a couple of days ago, which I thought was really helpful with talking to your younger kids, is kids really understand the concept of fairness. You gave her this much and I got that much. That's not fair. Or you told me I could do this, but then you changed your mind. That's not fair. They understand fairness. And so one of the examples that I saw that I thought was really good was, what if you were on the playground and someone stepped on your toe today and you went to tell the teacher, and the next day it didn't stop, and you told the teacher again, and you kept telling the teacher, but nothing ever changed, and you were still hurt and nothing happened to you? How would you feel? And a child might say, that's not fair. That's not okay. And so in talking to kids about what's going on in terms of race relations, talking to them in terms of fairness, how, well, these things are happening and we feel like these things aren't fair to anybody when it happens. And so that is why you might see mommy or daddy frustrated or angry or talking to grown-ups a lot about what's happening, because there's some unfair things happening to people. That is a way to have that discussion with younger kids. Our older kids at this point probably have been exposed or have had conversations about race relations with their friends, with other people. They've heard about it somewhat in social studies and in history. And so I would just even talk to them about, what questions do you have? You know, what are you hearing? What kind of conversations are you and your friends having or talking about? And just be prepared for questions, be prepared for whatever reactions you might get, because they're kids and this is difficult for them to process as well. Another thing that's really important is, this is a good time when you're having that conversation with your children. This is a good time to do a self-check, talking to your kids about whether they've had experiences where they felt mistreated, or whether they've mistreated someone, and not just because of them being a different skin color, but because of having a disability or learning at a different rate, or whatever the difference may be. Have there been experiences where they themselves have had that issue with someone, or whether they themselves have done that to someone else, so that we can talk to them about fair treatment and how we treat others and how we show kindness. And especially as believers, we want to talk to our kids about, how we treat others, and what it does to someone, how that impacts someone when they are when they're treated unfairly. Would you guys like to add anything to that in particular?
Yeah, I think all of those things are really good in starting those conversations and having those conversations. One thing that I do with my children is talk to them also about being an example. So you know these things, and you know that this is the way that you want to be treated. When you have those conversations, you're saying, how would you like to be treated? Then you always want to bring your child into understanding that they should be the example of these things. And also having a discussion with them, even in the midst of these discussions, about their own personal value. And I think it's really important. It's always been really important for kids to hear the great things that they're doing and how well they're doing things. And I think it's a perfect time to emphasize their value, their features, their beauty, their giftedness, and all of the various things that they're able to do, that we pour that into them constantly, because they might not receive that elsewhere, or that might be challenged in some other area for them. And so it's really important for them to gain comfort around their self-esteem and their self-worth, and really being built up in that way.
Absolutely.
Right. And just thinking about, my profession, and how a lot of the times I'm working with parents who of course have kids, and, they're working through their own issues, and they're trying to figure out how to navigate life. And so the parenting function and the family function is not as it should be. So a lot of times with them, I'm wanting to, figure out a way that they can speak to their children, even if they don't know, how to put it into words what's going on, because they can't even do it, hardly for themselves. Yeah. So a lot of times, I'm a big advocate of, getting a book that has a moral of the storybooks. We always used to read those when kids, to talk about what's fair, and to, talk about how, who is right and wrong in the situation, learn the difference of right and wrong. And so I still think, there's a ton of books, and a lot of them have been shared, online right now. A lot of them are being shared and getting, sold out everywhere, where people are able to buy these books and read them, and then have a conversation about them, even some with actual questions at the end, so that you can engage your child after you've read that. And I think now, just with my kids at their school, when they're doing the reading and they're talking about comprehension, so they have the comprehension questions, that comes along with their reading, and those can easily be adapted to the stories that are, letting kids know, about racism and things that they could encounter, or that people like them will encounter, and how they might handle that situation. So it's really important to, educate yourself as a parent, research what you can find on those different topics so that you'll know what is appropriate for that age. And a lot of course, books, they go by age. You can look at the level if you want your child to actually read it, look at the level of reading it is so that you can pick something that is, something that will appeal to your child and be able to get through that and have their understanding of it. So I think that is a really good tool to use for especially the small children.
Absolutely.
May not know, what's going on. When I've always worked as a professional, I always like working with teens because I feel like I can have like a real conversation with them. I don't really have to sugarcoat anything, and I feel like they, are able to open up to me and talk, give me that conversation that I'm looking for. And so I think it's, teens sometimes fall through the cracks a lot of times at that age because they're like the isolation, they don't want to be with the family. They don't want to engage with nobody, they're in their rooms, they're on the phones, they're on social media, things like that. And so it's very important to kind of pull them out of that and be like, this is our time to have a conversation or just open up the door, to have a conversation, because that's important too, knowing that, maybe they don't want to talk about it now, but if it does happen, then they know that they have that person they can come to. And I always like to say, it doesn't have to necessarily be the parent, especially with teens.
Right.
It can be anybody that is an adult that you feel that would give them, some information that is correct and, with love and things like that. So just having that, one person, you could, if they don't want to talk to you about it or they told you, identify that, help them identify that one person that they can go to, so that you can feel good, you can feel like, there's going to be an outlet for them, whether it's me or not. So I think that's, really important for teens as well. And also along with books, movies, there has been a lot of uptake in that with different movies that really show, racial injustice and, true stories of events of people that have been, affected by racism and inequality. And I think there's been a lot of people that's really opened up to, oh, I can watch this and, get some real education. You always have to be weary of Hollywood movies because they don't always, tell all the story, because they have to get it within a certain time or things like that. But, you have to research to see if it's a good one to watch with the family. A lot of those movies are rated PG-13. So, I think it would, that is definitely an avenue you can go if you don't know how to sit down and have that specific conversation.
I agree. I think those are all great ideas that you both shared. I know several weeks ago, not long after George Floyd was killed, we had an opportunity to sit down with the youth at Tabernacle of Praise and just do a Zoom conference, not with any particular agenda, but just to listen to them, just to let them talk and say what was on their minds, to give them a safe place to share. And they spoke up, they shared and they talked about their frustrations and, asked questions and things of that nature. And so I think it's so important just to, be able to be a listening ear and a sounding board for them, like you talked about, for sure. So thank you both for what you shared. We've talked a lot about trauma, different types of trauma, how it impacts people, what it looks like. So let's talk a little bit about what do we do when it comes to really building emotional strength and resilience. What does that look like in adults and children? How can we build that?
I always think, resilience is, I feel like just based on, my area of what I work in and things like that, like, there's certain people that, no matter what life throws at them, they're always being optimistic about the situation. They're trying to find the positive. I'm speaking about myself and others that, just want to, always just look on the bright side of things, come up with another alternative, when they always be like, well, I want to do this, don't say I want to do this, say I will do this, speaking it into existence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times, if you're that type of person, resiliency and most emotional strength is, comes naturally almost, to some people, and to others, it doesn't. you know, it's something that you kind of have to work towards. You know, you're not going to be able to let everything, you know, in, you know, everything's not good for you, you know, just like us, you know, a lot of people, kids and, you know, even adults now, we're always on social media, and everything that we see is not good for us. It's not helping with our emotional strength. It's not helping with our resilience. But you have to be mindful of that. You know, when we talk about building that, you know, it's something that you have to work on internally. You know, you have to work on yourself in order to be able to, you know, kind of put that energy out so other people can feel like, you know, they can do it. I just think of a scenario like when you're working on a path to recovery from alcohol or drug addiction or something like that. And, you know, they have this motivation, you know, you go into groups and things like that because they hear those positive stories, those resiliency stories from people that have overcome that, who has found the emotional strength to not, you know, engage in that anymore. So I really think, you know, one of the major things that could build that is a support system. You know, I feel like, you know, if a lot of people who have a support system in place, you know, does, you know, a lot better with maintaining, you know, good, healthy relationships and things like that, and getting through difficult times, you know. So you can look at a support system in different ways. You know, it used to be, it's always about family, you know, your family support system, but that is not always the case because, you know, people move around, you know, people might not have family that have those qualities. And so you look for family, you look for church, you know, you look for, you know, support groups, all of those different things that can help you, you know, can pour into you and build that emotional strength and resilience that you need. And then, of course, there's a lot of different ways you can engage in things that build emotional strength and resilience, you know, therapy, of course, you know, working through any issues, you know, and with the social media, you know, setting boundaries on that. You don't want to spend 3 hours on this, you know, when you know it's not any good for you, you know, those types of things. And so, you know, for me, through all this teleworking, I thought it was going to be great because I didn't actually have to go into work, but it turned into like a whole nother beast, you know, of, you know, homeschooling and, you know, and still working. And people having, you know, we're in the helping field. So more people needing help due to COVID, then more people needing help due to the racism and the inequality that has been, you know, blatantly put out there in front of us. And so I'm like, you know, oh, well, I don't know what I'm going to do when we have to keep doing this over and over again. So that for me, I've been, you know, exercising daily, you know, to kind of blow off some steam, you know, to forget about whatever's going on. And they used to always tell us as a social worker, don't take your work home with you. But what happens when your work is at home?
Right.
That, you know, that has been like running through my mind like over and over. I'm like, okay, this is not good. So definitely one of the things, like I said, setting boundaries, you know, not working all day and doing the same thing over and over, like that's emotional strength, because you have to be able to compartmentalize certain things so that you can be a productive person, you know?
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely. All of those are some really good points about building emotional strength. And I want to circle back really quickly to something that we talked about a little bit earlier, because I don't know if we fully, when we were talking about trauma, we were talking about vicarious trauma. I don't know if we fully sort of share what that secondary trauma looks like for people. But when we bring it to the current events and we bring it to these deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and all of the others that have died and been murdered, actually, and we have witnessed those things because we've seen them. Now it's all in the forefront because there are videos and there are pictures, and so we're experiencing that trauma, even though I wasn't shot or I wasn't killed. I saw that happen to somebody that I relate to. And so as an individual, we are experiencing that secondary trauma. And when it comes to building resilience, it's good to know the truth. I think it's really important to know what the truth is. And we talked a little bit earlier about the sickness and some of the behaviors that you see with kids and, you know, even adults sometimes as it relates to trauma. But you see a lot of times when you have people like Dylan Ruth, who killed the 9 church members in Charleston, and you apply mental illness to that person, there is no mental illness for racism. And so I think it's important to note that truth, because first of all, it's an insult. And secondly, for people that are struggling mentally or cognitively with their mental wellness, of people that are stressed and people that are exhausted, they're not going to connect to the need that comes to build that resilience if they feel like mentally ill people do stuff like that.
Right.
So I think it's really important to kind of touch on that, because no, racism is not, when you look at you can look at the sickness behind it, and you can look at the vile and perverted thoughts, and it speaks really more to what Trekeelia talked about earlier, and those how, you know, we will use the term wired, but those neurotransmitters and those things, the way you make connections early on in life, and those things that people have passed on. And so, you know, later in life, it says they, you know, the response is, oh, well, people had a bad childhood, you know, and that's not a mental illness to be racially driven. And so when it comes to resilience and building emotional support, I think it's important to know the truth and what that looks like, what it means, what does that mean that I have experienced this trauma, and how can I get through that? Right. And understanding what that really is. You know, it's okay to say, you know, I'm not doing well with this. You know, so that acknowledgement, I think, is a really important part of that. And, you know, as Black people, we have not traditionally acknowledged that we are not doing well, because we are a people of resilience. It's in our nature and in our culture to be resilient, because we have faced so many different struggles. So I definitely would say to really have an understanding and acknowledge when something is not right. It doesn't feel right. There, you know, there's something there. I'm overly stressed, or I'm overly impacted by this. It's affecting my daily life. Right. And really knowing that, so that you can apply a lot of the strategies that Jessica talked about, having that support system and having somebody that you trust to reach out to. And also, one thing that I really talk to people about a lot of times is celebrating the wins. It's really important to look, and, you know, Jessica talked about being positive and being optimistic, but it's really important not, you know, to also celebrate those tangible things that have happened when we have experienced that trauma, so that we can build ourselves up. Because yes, it's not the end goal, but it's something. And so you can see you can have these little victories all the way until you get to that end result. And I think that's really important in building resilience, because then you see some light at the end of the tunnel. And what we are accustomed to seeing and saying is, oh, you know, it's been like that. It's never going to change. That's, you know, but when we can celebrate those little things that have come along throughout time, I think that helps us to build that emotional support, like, you know, and being, you know, having an understanding of this is going somewhere, you know, I can do this, really. And then also, you know, just as a believer, it's extremely important to have you know, a prayer life, you know, to have some time that you are connecting with the Lord and talking to him and seeking guidance from him on how to do things and how to manage things, and asking for strength and believing that he's here and he's with us and he's desiring and willing to strengthen us through this time, because it can be really hard, you know, and we don't want to neglect our relationship with God, of course, but we don't want to neglect the guidance and support that we have by focusing so much attention. Jessica also talked about, you know, limiting social media and that kind of thing. I have an app on my phone you know, that counts my time on Facebook. And after that, it says you have reached your Facebook limit for the day, and I can't, you know, I can't access it. And that's important for me to have that trigger to say, okay, now stop. You know.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing that. Those are really a lot of great points and a lot of powerful things, especially when you circled back to racial prejudice, racism not being a mental illness, and needing to speak truth about those things. As you were talking, I thought about, you know, what that looks like when it comes to traumatic experiences and emotional resiliency as believers. You know, sometimes as believers, you know, we think that it's we have a hard time being with things being not okay. You know, we sometimes over spiritualize things and not acknowledge that sometimes we're just not okay. And it's okay sometimes to acknowledge that and to say, you know what, I'm not good. You know, I prayed today, and later in the evening, I found myself still feeling in despair. You know, I thought about this yesterday, just in terms of the Word of God, and weave throughout the Word of God are individuals and groups of people who dealt with pain and suffering. The people of Israel, you know, they were enslaved for hundreds of years. Pain and suffering, trauma. Job, pain and suffering, trauma there. And, you know, our Redeemer, Jesus himself, pain and suffering, being rejected by your own family, being betrayed, dying a cruel death on the cross, having loved ones look on as he died for us. There's pain and suffering there, and there's trauma. And so he's aware of our frame and who we are. He's aware of our weaknesses. And the fact of the matter is that we live in a fallen world. Things are going to impact us as believers, as people of God. And our prayer lives are so important. Having a fellowship of believers that surround us, so important. And knowing that it's okay not to be okay. And that God is next to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. That's what our word tells us. And I believe that a way that he does that is by the profession, the mental health profession, having mental health professionals such as yourselves, to be able to go and talk to someone who has who doesn't know you and has in a more objective point of view, who can help you work through those things. I think that's really important. Another thing that I think is really important for building emotional strength, especially for people who themselves have endured injustices, things that have blatantly happened to them, racism, things that have blatantly happened to them, things that have happened that have impacted their self-esteem in a way that you may see yourself. One of the things that I often do with my students when it comes to, you know, some of them who have self-esteem issues or issues with just negative thought patterns, is knowing that we can interrupt those negative thought patterns, and really, you know, thinking about what it is that's happened to you, that thing that's happened. What is the thought that you started developing? What's the narrative around that particular event that you started to develop? And a lot of times that narrative, that negative narrative, are lies. Those things are lies that we are telling ourselves. And so even doing something as simple as writing down those things that combat those lies. What's the truth that combats those lies? I'm more than a conqueror. I am fearfully and wonderfully made by God. Whatever it is, I'm good at this. You know, for my kids, sometimes we write affirmations, things that they're good at. Posting those things on your mirror, someplace where you can see them, especially if you're a visual person. I'm a visual person. And so being able to see those things and saying those things out loud, even if you have to do that multiple times a day, as sort of like a cognitive behavioral technique to build that self-esteem, and sometimes what we, you know, might refer to in the body of Christ as God esteem, really getting back to how God sees you and who he said, what he said about you in his word, about who you are and how you're made. Those kind of things combat some of those negative thinking patterns that we've developed that have become a part of our narratives, and kind of like a record that we have playing in our heads over and over. And I think that's really important. And I think in regards to children, I saw a quote the other day by a professor. He's a Southern Seminary professor who's written a really good book. And there are going to be some resources and some links attached to this video that you'll be able to check out some articles and things that can be very helpful. And there's a link to this book that he's written about for kids about the gospel in color. But he said something that I thought was really cool. And what he said was that, as believers, we must equip our kids to understand the society they live in so they can wisely navigate it with the gospel lens. And his name is Jarvis Johnson. And so I thought about a friend of mine. I heard her mention this maybe about a year ago, and I never heard it this way, but she talked about a legacy of faith. And so in building our kids up and building their emotional strength and even their strength in the body of Christ as believers, we want to make sure that we are modeling and instilling a love for God in our children and a love for his people. Because the fact of the matter is that, we've seen a lot of hatred, unfortunately. And so as believers, we want to make sure that we're having those conversations with them, and also building their emotional strength, teaching them about what God says about them in terms of their identity. Who are you? Who are you, and who does God say that you are? And those kind of things, in addition to them seeing us live out our faith, will build a legacy of faith for our children when they see us living it. One of the things that I thought about as well is, in the African-American community, trauma has been like a silent shadow in our lives at times. And we can sometimes unconsciously pass negative coping skills to our children. I think about the situation with the rioting and the protesting, and some of the negative comments that we heard about individuals who were rioting. And of course, we all know that, fundamentally rioting is wrong. But what I was really concerned about was the function of the behavior. In the education world, when we're talking about students' behavior problems, we look at something called an ABC model. A stands for antecedent, B is for behavior, C is the consequence. And I've had this conversation several times. In the African-American community, there are a lot of antecedents, a lot of events, a lot of things that have happened that precipitate the behavior that you see. So when you are frustrated, when you feel unheard, when that silent shadow of trauma and racism has been looming and you haven't really had the coping skills to deal with that, one of the things that might happen is rage and anger. Some of that may even have come out in writing, maybe why we saw that. And so, sometimes our African-American males in a lot of situations historically have had their masculinity stripped in a lot of ways. And so that is important to them to hold on and and so a lot of times they associate their masculinity with not showing a lot of emotion, or if the emotion does come out, you see it as rage and maybe anger. And so I just want to especially encourage our African-American males to really teach your young boys, teach our children, as well as the ladies, that it is okay to show emotion. Emotion is okay. That tears are okay, because what we don't want to do is get in the habit of teaching our kids to stuff that stuff down. We want to teach them how to cope with emotions, how to deal with things. Last school year, I remember talking a ton with my students about coping skills. How do we cope with situations, everyday situations, difficulties, problems in life that may be outside of our control? What can we do to control things? And things that we can control is how we cope with things. So exercise. I talk to kids about how exercise releases feel-good chemicals in our bodies. They release endorphins, they release serotonin, and that stuff makes you feel better. Being able to talk to a grown-up about the way that you're feeling. Being able to, I heard Jessica talk about journaling. I talk to my kids about journaling, and in some instances, even give them journals to write in. art expression, whether that is drawing, whether it is writing music, whether it's writing poetry. We have a youth at our church who is a great poet. And so when he was frustrated and having just issues with everything that was going on, he was writing poetry, and that's a great outlet. And so the important piece of that, though, is that in having those coping skills, we want to model those coping skills for our kids and say, you know what, I'm feeling upset today. Even verbalizing, this is what I'm going to do to deal with my upset feelings. I'm going for a walk today, and that's going to help me to feel better. Or, you know what, I had this big meeting coming up and I felt really anxious about it. And so I really sat down and I practiced taking deep breaths until I can feel my heart rate dropping, verbalizing the things that we're doing so that we're really modeling for them healthy ways of being able to deal with everyday difficulties and, of course, with trauma.
Right. And then just like you were saying, the healthy ways to figure out how we deal with things, like just knowing what that is for you. Because, you know, everybody's different. With me, it's education, you know, so with, you know, you hear in church, you know, you arm yourself with the word of God, you know it. So then when it's time for you to defend it, then you have accurate information that you're giving people. You're confident about what you're giving people. And so that also goes for, you know, what we're talking about, the trauma and, you know, the response to the impact of the trauma and how we deal with our kids. Like we, you know, we don't have to go off of what other people say. We don't have to just continue the same thing generation after generation. You know, if we arm ourselves with education and with resources, things like that, that help, that continue to change, you know, constantly, then we're able to better engage with, you know, our family, with our friends, with the community. And I always think that gives me, you know, that strength, you know, that gives me that feeling of resilience because, you know, I'm confident in what I know, you know, so that I think that everybody, you know, you have to look at what really, you know, helps you to, you know, move forward and have that emotional strength and resilience.
Absolutely. Anything to add, Narkeya?
No, I think that you guys made some really good points. I'm glad that you talked about just those cognitive behavioral techniques and just those thought patterns and processes, because that definitely affects the way that we see the world and the way that we view ourselves. So I'm really glad that you touched on that.
Absolutely. Well, ladies, this has been awesome. Thank you guys so much for all of the wisdom and the knowledge that you shared today. I encourage everyone to tune in for our next episode of Top Talk. Have an awesome day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.